The sun had barely crested the jagged horizon, casting long, thin shadows across the dusty streets of the town. The air was thick with the smell of smoke and horses, a smell that clung to boots and skirts alike. Townsfolk were beginning to gather, curious eyes peering from behind wooden shutters, from the steps of the saloon. From every corner where gossip might be brewing, there was a tension that seemed to vibrate in the very boards under their feet, a sense that something was about to break. And nobody knew exactly what. At the center of the square, a young woman stood, her shoulders stiff, her chin raised, despite the fear that fluttered in her chest. She wore a simple dress, faded and patched from hard work. But there was a dignity in the way she held herself that made her presence impossible to ignore. Her father loomed over her, a tall man with a weathered face, lined with years of stubborn authority and anger. His hands were rough and calloused, and they moved in a way that betrayed both familiarity and menace. The town had seen him punish her before, but today felt different. Today the air seemed too still, the horizon too sharp, as if the earth itself had paused to watch what would happen next. The townspeople whispered to each other, their voices low and cautious. Children clung to their mothers' skirts, hiding from the scene yet unable to look away. The blacksmith leaned against the post of his shop, wiping sweat from his brow, his eyes narrowing. Even the sheriff, a man whose authority had rarely been questioned, lingered at the edge of the crowd, uncertain how to intervene without inviting chaos. Everyone felt it, that oppressive, uneasy weight of a reckoning waiting to fall. Her father's voice rose suddenly, rough and accusing, echoing off the wooden storefronts. The words struck her like stones, sharp and heavy, carrying the force of years of judgment and control. Her heart thumped wildly, pounding against her ribs as though it might break free. She did not speak, did not beg. Her silence was a shield and a statement all at once. The crowd shifted, sensing the escalation. Some muttered, some looked away, unwilling to witness what they feared, yet unable to leave. The square felt smaller, more suffocating with every moment, as if the town itself had gathered just to hold its breath. Then, as her father's hand moved in a motion that promised punishment, the air cracked with a voice that seemed to tear through the dust and heat like lightning. "She's my wife." The words were raw, urgent, and defiant. Every head turned sharply, eyes widening, mouths opening in surprise. Time slowed. The young woman froze mid-step, staring at the figure who had just claimed her in front of the entire town. The Apache warrior stood tall, his dark hair caught in the sunlight, his gaze unflinching and steady. The pride in his stance, the fierceness in his eyes, was a challenge thrown to the world itself. A ripple ran through the crowd. Whispers became murmurs. Murmurs became murmurs of disbelief. Some townsfolk stepped back, unsure whether to intervene or retreat, unsure whether to witness the unfolding storm. Her father's hand wavered, his face contorting in shock and rage. It's the kind that had once commanded obedience, now struggling against an unexpected force. For the first time, the authority he had wielded like a weapon seemed uncertain. Almost fragile, the young woman's eyes flickered between the two men, the father who had ruled her life with an iron hand, and the warrior who now declared a bond that defied the small town's judgment. She could feel every gaze upon her, every heartbeat of the onlookers pressing in, yet beneath it all, a strange kind of relief began to unfurl within her. There was a promise in that voice, a protection she had never known. And though she dared not hope too loudly, her chest felt a little lighter, her shoulders a little less burdened. Her father's voice finally broke the silence, trembling not just with anger, but with disbelief. "You dare?" He faltered, as if the words were insufficient to capture the enormity of the challenge before him. The warrior did not falter. His jaw was set, and his hands rested easily on the weapons at his side. Not a threat, but a warning. Every movement, every detail, the way his boots pressed into the dirt, the wind catching the edges of his shirt, spoke of someone unafraid to face what the world demanded of him. Around them, the town seemed to hold its breath. Some faces showed fear, others fascination, and some long-hidden curiosity. It was a moment suspended between the past and the possibility of something entirely new. The square, once a place of routine and quiet judgment, had become the stage for a confrontation that would ripple far beyond the wooden fences and dusty streets. The sun climbed higher, casting sharper shadows, and every person present knew they were witnessing the breaking of old rules. The young woman's fingers twitched, brushing against the fabric of her dress as though grounding herself in the moment. She had known fear, known pain, and yet a new pulse of courage was rising inside her. She wanted to speak, to say something, but the right words were trapped, tangled in the whirlwind of the square and the clash of wills surrounding her. Her eyes met the warriors, and in that silent connection, an understanding passed between them. They were no longer just individuals. Caught in a storm, they were a force that demanded recognition, a challenge to the world that had always sought to control them. Even the children in the crowd seemed to sense the change, their small eyes wide, watching a drama far beyond their understanding, yet imprinted upon them like a story they would one day tell. Horses shifted uneasily, the creak of wheels and the shuffle of boots punctuating the tension in the air. Every detail, every small sound became magnified, echoing in a silence that was almost sacred. The town itself seemed to lean in, waiting for a decision, a motion, a crack in the fragile certainty that had held the square together for so many years. The father's breathing grew heavier, ragged with anger and confusion as he tried to weigh the impossible, a claim he could not simply dismiss. A presence that challenged not just him, but the very sense of order he had enforced. The warrior's hand rested casually on the hilt of his weapon, yet it was not a threat in the conventional sense, it was a statement. Strength, resolve, and devotion were wrapped into one unyielding stance that no amount of shouting or pleading could dismantle. The crowd's whispers grew louder, yet no one dared to move forward. The sun climbed higher still, painting the square in harsh light and deep shadow, as if nature itself was amplifying the moment, casting judgment from above. Every heartbeat seemed to carry the weight of anticipation, and the young woman felt it deep in her bones, the knowledge that nothing would ever be the same, that life as she had known it had ended the moment the warrior's voice cut through the tension. Then, just as the father took a step forward, his hand trembling with fury and confusion, a silence fell again. Not the quiet of peace, but the quiet of a storm held at the brink of something dangerous and profound, poised to explode. The young woman's breath caught in her throat, her eyes locked on the man who had stepped into her life in such an unimaginable way. The Apache warrior's words hung in the air, bold and defiant, and for a heartbeat. The town square was suspended between what had been and what might come. And in that pause, the young woman realized that nothing would protect her from the coming storm but the courage of the man who claimed her, the courage she had yet to fully summon, and the unspoken power of a love and defiance that had dared to challenge the entire town. Every gaze was upon them, every expectation hanging heavy like the midday sun. The next moment would change everything, though none could yet know exactly how. The town waited, the air trembling with anticipation, and somewhere deep in her chest, the young woman felt a stirring of hope mingled with fear. The father's eyes blazed, the warrior's stance remained unbroken, and the town square, once ordinary, once silent, had become the arena for a story that would be remembered long after the dust had settled. Then the wind shifted, kicking dust into the air, and the tension of the square seemed to thrum in every nerve. The father opened his mouth to speak, the warrior's hand tightened slightly at his side, and the young woman's heart raced as though it were keeping time with the mounting storm. And in that fragile, impossible instant, nothing moved except the promise that everything was about to change. The sun blazed overhead, casting light on every face, every weapon, every whispered question, and the town square held its breath, waiting for the moment that would decide the fate of a young woman, her defiant warrior, and the unforgiving authority of her past. The story had only begun. The wind rattled through the wooden shutters of the saloon, carrying the scent of dust and horse sweat across the square. People shifted nervously, unsure whether to take sides, whether to intervene, or whether to let events unfold as they might. The young woman's heart still raced, but beneath the fear was a memory, a flash of her life before this moment, a life where control had always been someone else's, where her own choices had been stifled under the heavy hand of her father. She remembered the small cabin at the edge of the town, the creaking boards, the cold nights where she had huddled beneath rough blankets, wishing for a freedom she had never known. Her father had always been a man shaped by his own struggles, hardened by years of isolation and hardship in a land that demanded toughness above all else. He had come from a line of men who believed authority was a birthright, who thought love and fear were interchangeable, who thought respect was earned through fear more than care. She had grown up under his shadow, learning to bend, to smile through anger, to hide her true thoughts behind a mask of obedience. And yet, even as a child, she had glimpsed moments of kindness, brief flashes of a man who could be gentle, who could laugh when the wind carried a tune across the hills, who could soften when the world allowed it. Those moments were rare, and they had made her realize the contrast between who he could be and the man he often chose to show the world. The warrior standing before them was a figure she had first seen months ago, long before the sun had ever beaten down on this square. He had appeared at the edge of town one evening riding alone, his horse kicking up clouds of dust that glimmered in the dying light. People had watched him with suspicion. Outsiders were always met with caution, but he had not come as a threat. There was a calm in his presence, a sense that he moved through the world with knowledge of its dangers, but without fear of them. He had spoken little, yet every word he did offer carried weight, respect, and the quiet assurance of someone who had survived much and learned. Even more, she remembered the first conversation they had. Under the shadow of the old oak by the river, he had asked about her life, not with judgment, not with the curiosity of a stranger, but with genuine interest, as though he already understood the burdens she carried. She had been hesitant at first, unsure if trust was something she could afford, but there had been something in his eyes, a steadiness, a patience that allowed her to let pieces of herself slip through the walls she had built. And slowly, she had realized that this man, this Apache warrior, saw her as more than a child to be guided, more than a possession to be controlled. He saw her as a person. Her father's hand twitched as if he might strike again, but he did not. His gaze darted between the warrior and the young woman, searching for a weakness, a reason, a justification for what had happened, for what was being declared. The square felt charged, every heart beating in time with the rising tension. Some of the townsfolk began murmuring to each other, their voices a mix of fear, curiosity, and indignation. They had lived in this small town for years, seen disputes settled in whispered threats or sudden violence, and yet nothing in their experience had prepared them for the boldness of this moment. The young woman's mind drifted back to the day she had first realized her father's anger could not be reasoned with. It had been in the spring, and the wildflowers were blooming along the hills, and the air carried the scent of fresh grass and new beginnings. She had spoken out of turn, asked a question that he had deemed disrespectful. The punishment had come swiftly, publicly, in a way that had humiliated her beyond words. The memory burned in her chest now, fueling both fear and determination. She could not let that history repeat itself, not if she could help it. And yet, standing here in the open square, the past and present collided, and she felt the weight of every gaze pressing down upon her. The Apache warrior stepped slightly forward, his presence commanding the space between her and her father. He did not raise his voice, did not shout, yet his words from moments before hung in the air, unbroken and unyielding. His hand rested casually at his side, near the hilt of the knife he always carried, but it was not a threat. It was a promise that he would not let her be harmed, that he would stand as a shield, that he would confront the entire town if necessary to protect what he claimed. The authority in his posture, the certainty in his gaze, unsettled her father in a way that the young woman had never seen before. People began to take tentative steps backward, unsure where loyalty should lie. Some remembered the warrior's kindness and small gestures, helping a horse that had thrown its rider, aiding a child who had fallen in the dirt, offering water to travelers in need. Others recalled the rumors, the whispers of a man who had survived dangers that others had not, who carried a reputation both feared and respected among distant tribes and towns alike. The combination of strength, compassion, and mystery made him an enigma, a figure impossible to ignore. And now, in the heart of the square, that enigma had placed himself squarely between a father and a daughter, and claimed a bond that no one could easily dismiss. The young woman's eyes flicked to the horizon, as if seeking escape, yet she knew there was nowhere to run. Every street, every alley, every boarded-up window seemed to watch her, to judge her, to measure her worth. And yet, for the first time, she felt that she did not have to face the judgment alone. The warrior's presence was a weight she could lean on, a strength that allowed her to stand taller, breathe more freely, and meet the crowd's gaze without crumbling. There was courage in that, quiet and steady. A courage she had only begun to recognize in herself. Her father's face grew red with anger, his jaw tightening, his eyes narrowing as he struggled to assert control over a situation that had slipped beyond his grasp. The townspeople whispered urgently now, some debating whether to intervene, some questioning the legitimacy of the claim, some simply watching with morbid fascination. The square had transformed from a place of routine to a stage of moral and social confrontation. Every glance, every gesture, every subtle movement was loaded with meaning. She remembered the early days of the warrior's presence in her life, the lessons he had shared. Not just in survival, but in resilience, in standing firm against injustice, in protecting what mattered without hesitation. His hands had shown her how to tie knots, how to navigate the wilderness, how to read the signs in the wind and stars. But more than that, his words had taught her to value her own voice, to understand that her choices were hers alone, and that bravery could take many forms, sometimes quiet, sometimes defiant. The father shifted, his boots scraping against the dirt, sending up tiny clouds that danced in the sunlight. He muttered something under his breath, a string of words that carried more threat than sense. Yet the warrior did not move. He stood rooted, unflinching, his expression calm, almost serene, yet undeniably strong. The crowd leaned in closer. The collective breath of the town caught in a suspended tension that made every heartbeat feel magnified. The young woman's mind wandered to the nights. She had spent dreaming of a life beyond this small town, a life unbound by fear and punishment, a life that could exist in the open, under wide skies and endless horizons. She had imagined a companion, a protector, someone who understood her in ways her father never could. She had not known it could be real, had not dared to hope that someone would step forward, bold enough to claim her against the expectations of a town. And now, as the warrior's gaze met hers, she realized that hope had taken form, tangible and resolute. Standing between her and the world that sought to dictate her fate, the townspeople exchanged anxious glances. Some looked to the sheriff, hoping for intervention, hoping for a return to order. Some glanced to each other, whispering questions that had no answers. Children clutched hands, eyes wide with the mixture of fear and fascination. The square was alive with tension, every face reflecting a different shade of curiosity, fear, or admiration. Her father's breathing was uneven now, each inhale sharp with frustration, each exhale trembling with a mix of disbelief and rage. He had ruled the town of her childhood, imposed his will with the certainty of tradition and fear. And yet, in the face of this unexpected challenge, his authority seemed fragile, almost laughable. The warrior had not just stepped into the square. He had stepped into the very fabric of her life, tearing at old patterns, rewriting the rules in a single, uncompromising declaration. The young woman felt a surge of determination rising inside her, a strength she had not known she possessed. She knew the path ahead would not be easy, that the clash between her father and the warrior was only the beginning. The whispers of the town, the weight of expectation, the shadow of past punishments, all of it pressed against her. But for the first time, she felt capable of meeting it, capable of standing tall in the face of fear. The warrior's hand at his side, the calm in his eyes, and the unspoken promise between them gave her courage. And yet, the square remained unresolved. The father's fury simmered, the townspeople's murmurs grew, and the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch into the future. Every step, every word, every choice had yet to be made. The young woman knew that the story of this day was far from over, that the challenge laid down by the warrior would be tested in ways she could not yet imagine. and deep inside, she felt the pull of destiny, a force as unpredictable as the wind across the plains. As relentless as the sun beating down on the wooden boards beneath her feet, the tension hung thick, unbroken, a storm waiting to erupt. Every eye, every heartbeat, every breath in the square bore witness to a story that had only begun. And as the young woman, her father, and the warrior stood at the center of it all, the future seemed both terrifying and full of possibility, an open horizon waiting to be claimed. The sun beat down on the town square, baking the dust into the boots of everyone gathered, making the air shimmer with heat and tension. The young woman's pulse throbbed in her ears as she tried to remain steady, her hands pressed lightly against the folds of her dress. She could feel the crowd's eyes on her, each gaze a judgment, each murmur a reminder of how tightly the town clung to its routines, to the ways it had always measured loyalty and obedience. And yet, beneath the stifling heat and the weight of expectation, there was a pulse of defiance that she could no longer ignore. Her father's face was tight with fury, veins pulsing at his temples, and the deep lines in his weathered skin seemed to deepen as he tried to formulate a response. Years of authority and fear were unraveling before him. The stubborn pride that had kept him in control of his family and his property now felt like a fragile veneer. He glanced at the townspeople, hoping for allies, but their faces told him nothing. Some were startled, some were curious, some seemed to take delight in the spectacle. But no one stepped forward to enforce the power he had always assumed was unquestioned. The Apache warrior remained calm, his presence a solid line between the young woman and her father. His dark eyes scanned the crowd, taking in every reaction, every whispered comment, every shift in posture. There was a quiet authority in the way he moved, a sense that he understood both the danger and the fragility of the moment. He had arrived in town as an outsider, yet now he stood as a shield and a challenge, embodying both protection and defiance. The crowd felt it, and even those who were uncertain of the claim he had made could not deny the strength in his presence. The young woman's thoughts drifted to the days before this confrontation, to the long nights when she had worked alongside her father in the fields, when she had seen the other side of him, quiet moments of care, fleeting gestures of tenderness. Those memories clashed with the anger she had endured, creating a tension that twisted in her chest. She realized that the father who had punished her publicly had also shaped her understanding of resilience and survival. She had learned to anticipate cruelty, to navigate a world ruled by harsh judgment. And yet she had never imagined a day when someone would step in to claim her freedom so boldly. A few of the townsfolk began murmuring among themselves, debating what this claim meant. Some spoke of propriety, questioning the sudden appearance of a bond that defied their traditions. Others whispered of the warrior's past. Tales carried on the wind from distant plains and neighboring settlements, stories of skill and survival, of bravery in battle, of a man who had earned respect without needing to demand it. The mix of fear, admiration, and suspicion rippled through the square, adding layers of uncertainty to an already tense scene. Her father's eyes narrowed, focusing on the warrior with a mixture of rage and disbelief. "You think you can just claim her?" he growled, his voice low but sharp enough to cut through the murmurs. "You have no right in this town, no right over my daughter, no right over my family." His hand flexed, ready for action, yet he did not strike. Something held him back, something in the warrior's gaze that he could not ignore. The warrior's voice was calm, deliberate. "I claim her because she chose me, because she has the right to her own life, her own path. You may not understand it, but I will not let harm come to her." His words were steady, unwavering, carrying the weight of someone who had faced far worse than the fear of a single town. Every syllable was a declaration, a challenge, and a promise that resonated through the square. The young woman felt the heat rise in her cheeks, a mix of fear, relief, and anticipation. Her father had always believed he controlled her destiny, but in this moment, she realized that destiny was something she could seize for herself, and yet she could not ignore the tension that still crackled between her and her father. Between the traditions of the town and the assertion of her freedom, the conflict was far from over, and the storm waiting to break was visible in every furrowed brow, every whispered word, every shift in stance. From the edges of the square, Merchants and townspeople began weighing in, offering opinions that carried more weight than they knew. The blacksmith, a broad man with soot-stained hands, spoke quietly to the sheriff, questioning whether law could intervene when social custom had been so brazenly challenged. Children peeked from behind their mothers, sensing danger yet mesmerized by the unfolding drama. Women who had endured hardships in silence exchanged glances, recognizing the courage in the young woman's stance and the warrior's defiance. The tension multiplied with every perspective, every angle, creating a network of conflict that extended far beyond the immediate. Confrontation. The young woman's thoughts returned to the journey that had brought her here, to the small choices that had accumulated over time, the defiance in a single word, the refusal to hide her thoughts, the quiet determination to hold on to her own identity. Each moment had led to this confrontation. Now she realized that her own courage was intertwined with the warrior's. He had entered her life as a protector, yes, but also as a catalyst, pushing her toward a strength she had never fully recognized. Her father's voice rose again, shaking with fury and disbelief. "This is not how things are done. You cannot." His words were cut off by a sudden, sharp exhale from the crowd. A collective realization that tradition and fear were being challenged in real time. Some townspeople stepped back, some leaned closer, all waiting for the inevitable clash that seemed poised to erupt. The square felt smaller, yet the stakes had grown larger than the boundaries of its dusty streets. The warrior shifted slightly, just enough to remind everyone of his readiness, of his unyielding presence. He did not speak again immediately, letting the weight of his claim hang in the air, forcing the father and the town to consider it. It was a quiet form of power, one that relied not on aggression, but on certainty, on calm in the face of chaos. His hands remained near his weapons. But the promise behind the gesture was not violence, it was defense, protection. An unwavering resolve. The young woman's mind wandered to the small moments that revealed the warrior's character, the times he had gone out of his way to help others, the quiet insistence on fairness and honesty, the way he had listened without judgment. Those qualities, she realized, were rare in a world shaped by harsh rules and unyielding authority. And now, in the square, facing her father and the judgment of the town, those qualities were exactly what made his claim so powerful, so undeniable. Even if not everyone would admit it, whispers continued to ripple through the crowd, mixing with the creaking of wagon wheels and the lowing of cattle waiting outside the town limits. Each voice, each perspective, each personal history contributed to the complexity of the moment. Some sided silently with the young woman, recognizing the injustice she had endured. Others clung to tradition, fearful of change and the disruption of long-held social norms. Every glance, every murmur, every hesitation built the tension further, layering the conflict like the dust that clung stubbornly to the town's buildings. Her father's hands trembled, a subtle sign of the frustration and uncertainty that roiled beneath the surface. He had never faced such a challenge, never had someone claim what he considered his without fear or hesitation. The townspeople could see it, some with shock, some with anticipation, all with a growing awareness that the balance of power was shifting in real time. The young woman felt the weight of that awareness, yet also a sense of possibility, a recognition that the confrontation could be the beginning of something entirely new, a chance to step into her own life. Guided by her own choices, the warrior's eyes met hers for a brief moment, a silent reassurance that they faced this together, that no matter the outcome, he would not let her stand alone. It was a small gesture, almost imperceptible to the crowd, but to her, it was everything. Courage, solidarity, and love, all intertwined in a single glance, strengthening her resolve and heightening the tension that already thickened the air. From another corner of the square, the sheriff shifted his weight, uncertain whether to intervene or to observe. Law and order had its place in the town, but the complexities of human loyalty and family authority could not always be measured in statutes. His eyes flicked from the father to the warrior, and he weighed the potential consequences of any action. Every decision he considered carried the potential to escalate or to diffuse the situation. Yet the unpredictability of human emotion made every choice a gamble. The young woman felt the layers of history pressing down on her, the expectations of a town, the weight of her father's authority, the whispers of her peers, the judgment of strangers, and the quiet strength of a warrior who had entered her life with no guarantee of acceptance. All these forces collided in the square, creating a tension that felt almost tangible, as though the very air quivered under its weight. And in the middle of it, she stood, fragile yet unyielding, aware that the coming moments would shape the course of her life in ways she could not yet predict. The father's breathing grew heavy, his face flushed with the struggle to maintain control. The warrior remained composed, calm, and ready, a steady presence against the storm. The townspeople continued to murmur, some shifting uncomfortably, some watching with fascination, and some quietly rooting for the young woman's freedom. Dust rose from the ground as boots scraped, horses shifted uneasily, and the sunlight painted the square in stark, dramatic light. Every moment stretched, every heartbeat amplified, and the square felt suspended in time. Conflicts layered upon conflicts, the battle for authority. It's a clash of tradition and change, the struggle for personal freedom, and the test of courage and loyalty all converged in this single place. And as the young woman held her ground, her father's fury clashed with the warrior's resolve. The story of the day became more than just a confrontation. It became a test of values, identity, and the unpredictable force of human will. The square remained on the edge of chaos, every gaze and every whisper building toward a moment that had yet to arrive. And deep inside, the young woman knew that the choices made here, in these tense, unyielding minutes, would echo far beyond the boundaries of the town, shaping the lives of all involved. Even as the storm of conflict continued to swell around them, the heat in the town square pressed down heavier now, as if the sun itself were conspiring to intensify the tension. Every whisper from the crowd carried the weight of expectation. Every shifting boot on the dirt made the suspense grow thicker. The young woman stood in the center, her chest tight, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped the folds of her dress. She could feel every gaze upon her, every judgment hanging invisible in the air. And yet the warrior beside her offered a steadying presence. His eyes, dark and unwavering, scanned the square, measuring the crowd, assessing the threat and silently promising protection. Her father's voice finally broke the silence, sharp and brittle, carrying anger that was laced with fear. "You don't know what you're doing. This isn't a game." His hands trembled slightly as he gestured, the sun catching the lines of his knuckles and making them seem more like weapons than human appendages. The townspeople flinched at his words, aware that the older man's authority had always been absolute, yet sensing that for the first time it might be slipping through his fingers. The warrior said nothing, but his stance spoke volumes. He was calm, composed, unyielding, a figure of quiet power that contrasted sharply with the father's jittering aggression. Every person in the square could feel the tension between them, the unspoken clash of wills, the challenge that seemed bigger than either man alone. The young woman's heart thudded, each beat a drum of anticipation. Something in the way the warrior held himself suggested he was ready to defend her no matter what came next. Even against a man who had ruled over her life for as long as she could remember, the crowd had grown restless. Some stepping closer, others backing away, uncertain whether to intervene or remain observers. The murmurs shifted to louder voices as old rivalries and personal fears came to the surface. The blacksmith muttered something under his breath. The bartender peeked out from the saloon doorway. A group of children huddled together, whispering questions that they would not dare to speak aloud. Every person present seemed to feel the electricity in the air, the impossible weight of the moment pressing down, making the square feel smaller. Even as the stakes grew larger, the young woman thought back to the first time she had seen the warrior ride into town. She had been cautious, skeptical of anyone who entered their small, rigid world uninvited. And yet, over the weeks and months that followed, she had come to see a man who lived by a different code, one built on respect, courage, and an unshakable sense of right and wrong. He had shown her how to stand tall, how to defend herself without striking blindly, and how to trust the strength she had always carried inside but had been told to suppress. Now that strength and his presence were intertwined. A combination that made her feel simultaneously frightened and unstoppable. Her father's breathing grew ragged, a sound that carried both fury and confusion. He had ruled his household, his fields, his life, with certainty for decades, yet here was a man who refused to submit to any expectation other than his own. The father's fists clenched at his sides, and for a moment, the square seemed to hold its collective breath, waiting for the first strike. The first act that would shatter the fragile balance. The warrior finally shifted. A subtle movement that drew the attention of every observer. He did not reach for a weapon in aggression, but the motion reminded everyone that he was prepared, that he could act decisively if necessary. His eyes flicked to the young woman, a silent reassurance that whatever came next, he would not let her face it alone. And for the first time in the square, there was a glimmer of hope, a small spark that pierced the suffocating tension, suggesting that courage could exist even in the face of intimidation. From the edges of the square, whispers grew into murmurs, murmurs into discussions. The townspeople were caught between loyalty to tradition and the shock of witnessing defiance firsthand. Some feared that the warrior's claim would disrupt the delicate order of the town, that old rules were being broken in front of their very eyes. Others felt an unspoken admiration for his boldness, recognizing a kind of justice that had long been denied in the shadow of the father's authority. Every perspective added a layer of complexity to the moment, each one a potential spark for conflict. The young woman's mind raced, memories colliding with the present moment. She recalled the harsh lessons of obedience, the sting of punishments, and the isolation of living in a house where fear was often mistaken for respect. Yet she also remembered small acts of kindness, moments of fleeting laughter, and the briefest glimmer of connection with her father that hinted at what might have been if life had been different. Those memories tugged at her heart, complicating the emotions that now surged inside her, blending fear, anger, hope, and defiance into a heady mix that made her pulse race even faster. The father's voice rose, trembling with frustration. "This isn't the way. You think shouting words can undo years of tradition?" His eyes darted around the crowd, searching for support, for anyone who would reinforce his authority, and yet the uncertainty in the townspeople's faces only heightened his anger. The silence that followed was heavy, the kind that presses down and makes every sound, every movement, every heartbeat feel amplified. The warrior took a single step forward, breaking the silence with a presence that demanded attention. He did not shout, did not challenge in anger, but every inch of his stance conveyed an unyielding resolve. He was ready to face whatever came, to defend the claim he had made, and to protect the young woman at all costs. The crowd felt it, a subtle tension that could not be denied, a quiet assertion of power that stood in stark contrast to the father's wavering confidence. The young woman swallowed hard, her thoughts flicking to the future she had imagined, to the life she had longed for beyond the restrictions of her small town. She had dreamed of freedom, of choice, of a chance to live without fear dominating every decision. And now, standing in the center of the square, with a warrior claiming her side and a father refusing to yield, that dream seemed closer than it ever had, yet frighteningly fragile. The sheriff shifted his weight, finally stepping forward just enough to indicate he was aware of the conflict, yet careful not to escalate it. Law and order had rules, but human emotion and family ties were far messier, far more unpredictable. Every movement he made was watched, every word unspoken weighed heavily in the charged atmosphere. The crowd looked to him, some for guidance, some for reassurance, some simply for a signal that things could return to normal. The young woman's gaze returned to the warrior, and in that silent exchange they acknowledged the stakes of the moment. This was more than a clash of wills. It was a test of courage, identity, and loyalty. Every glance, every breath, every subtle gesture carried meaning. She realized that their bond, forged in quiet moments and shared struggles, was about to be tested in a way neither of them could have anticipated. The father's hand twitched, the first real sign that he might act, and the crowd stiffened, leaning closer, caught between curiosity and fear. The sun reflected off the dusty boards beneath their feet, casting shadows that seemed to stretch and twist in anticipation of what might come next. Horses shifted uneasily, the creak of wagon wheels punctuated the tension, and the very air seemed thick with expectation. The young woman thought of the whispered conversations she had shared with the warrior, the advice he had given her on standing firm, on trusting her instincts, on refusing to be intimidated. She drew strength from those memories, feeling a courage she had never known before. And yet the reality of the square, of her father's fury, of the crowd's attention, made every step forward feel like stepping onto a knife's edge. Her father's voice rose again, cracking with rage. "You cannot make this right. You have no say here, no claim, nothing." His eyes blazed, scanning the crowd for someone, anyone, who might support him. But the murmurs continued, the tension grew, and the sense that tradition could not simply enforce compliance began to ripple through the onlookers. The warrior's hand brushed slightly against the hilt of his knife, a subtle reminder of readiness, but not aggression. He did not need to speak. His calm defiance was more powerful than any words could be. Every eye in the square took in the scene, measuring the impossible balance between fury and restraint, between challenge and protection. The young woman felt her heart pound, every nerve on edge, every breath shallow, knowing that the next moments could erupt into chaos, or change everything in ways she could not yet predict. Children peered from behind skirts and shop doors, sensing the danger, yet drawn to the drama like moths to a flame. Merchants whispered to each other, debating the outcome, weighing the risks, wondering how far the father might go and how firmly the warrior would stand. The square had become a stage of human tension, a collision of wills, a crucible where fear, courage, authority, and defiance intersected. The young woman clenched her fists lightly, feeling the warrior's presence beside her, drawing strength from him while also finding her own. Her father's shadow loomed, long and dark, but she was no longer the same girl who had once stood silently under his authority. She had a chance now, and the warrior's claim was the spark that ignited it. The father took a deliberate step forward, his boots scraping against the hard-packed dirt, and the crowd froze in collective anticipation. The warrior shifted slightly, a warning and a promise, all in one. And the young woman's chest tightened with a mixture of fear and exhilaration. Every person in the square seemed to hold their breath, waiting for the inevitable moment when action would be taken, when the balance of power would be tested in a way that could not be ignored. Time seemed to stretch, each second heavy with the weight of what could happen. The sun beat down, the dust swirled, and the tension in the square became almost unbearable. Every glance, every whisper, every heartbeat contributed to the suspense, building toward a climax that felt inevitable yet unpredictable. And in the midst of it all, the young woman stood tall, the warrior unwavering at her side, and the father trembling with the knowledge that the world he thought he controlled might be slipping from his grasp. The moment was on the edge of eruption, every element aligned to make the next action impossible to ignore. Horses snorted nervously, windows rattled, and the murmurs of the crowd crescendoed into a low hum of anticipation. The square itself seemed to pulse with expectation, as though the land and sky and sun were watching along with every human present. The young woman felt a cold edge of fear, knowing that the confrontation could spiral into violence. Yet beneath it was a stronger pulse of determination. She had faced hardship, endured punishment, and survived. And now she had a chance to step into her own life. Supported by the warrior and tested by the world she had long sought to escape, her father's hand flexed again, a dangerous twitch that made the crowd tense. While the warrior's calm presence remained a counterbalance, every heartbeat seemed to echo like a drum of warning, every gaze fixed on the two men and the woman who stood between them. The square had become a crucible, the anticipation almost tangible. And the story of the day was about to reach a moment where choices, courage, and defiance would collide in a way that no one could ignore. The tension held, unbroken, the stage set for the moment that would test everything: the authority of a father, the courage of a warrior, and the will of a young woman determined to claim her own destiny. Every person in the square waited, breathless, as the threads of conflict pulled tighter, ready to snap, and the air seemed charged with the electricity of impending action. The tension in the square finally snapped, not with a yell or a strike, but with a pause that carried the weight of inevitability. The father's hand, raised and trembling, fell slowly to his side. His chest heaved as he struggled to reconcile years of authority with the reality that now faced him. His daughter was no longer a piece of his control. The townspeople held their breath, sensing the shift. The subtle change in power that spoke louder than any confrontation ever could. The warrior stepped closer to the young woman. But his hand did not reach for her in a protective gesture. Instead, it hovered near, a silent assurance, a quiet promise that he would stand with her, not above her. The father's eyes flicked from the warrior to his daughter, searching for rebellion, resistance, or a plea for forgiveness. Instead, he found calm determination, a strength he had never seen in her before, the kind that could not be intimidated or bent. The realization hit him like the desert sun. His daughter had grown beyond his reach. A hush fell over the crowd, broken only by the soft shuffle of boots in the dust and the distant clatter of wagon wheels. The blacksmith leaned against his post, nodding subtly, while the children, who had been whispering nervously, began to step forward cautiously, curious about the quiet resolution. Even the sheriff seemed to relax slightly, recognizing that the confrontation had resolved itself without bloodshed, a rare feat in a town so prone to immediate judgment. The young woman finally spoke, her voice steady, though soft. "Father, I will always respect you, but my life is my own, and I must make my own choices." The words, simple and clear, carried the weight of years of suppressed courage. The father's jaw tightened, a mixture of pride and lingering frustration flashing in his eyes. But he said nothing. He could not argue with truth, and he could not undo the bond that had been acknowledged so publicly. The warrior's eyes softened as he glanced at her, a subtle nod that acknowledged her courage, her strength, and the journey that had brought them to this moment. He had never forced her hand, never claimed her will beyond the words that announced their partnership. Together, they stood as equals, a quiet defiance that challenged not just her father, but the rigid traditions of the town. The crowd, sensing the shift, began to murmur in admiration, and a few even offered tentative smiles, acknowledging that sometimes courage and love could change even the hardest hearts. Her father finally spoke, his voice lower, less sharp than before. "I don't understand all of this," he admitted, a hint of vulnerability slipping through. "But I see that you are strong, and perhaps stronger than I ever knew." The words were grudging, but they carried a weight of acceptance that surprised everyone. The young woman's eyes softened, recognizing that forgiveness and understanding could coexist with authority. Even if belatedly, the townspeople began to relax. Though the energy of the square remained charged with the memory of confrontation, the baker stepped out from his shop with a loaf of bread, offering it as a gesture of normalcy. The blacksmith returned to work, hammer striking metal, the familiar rhythm grounding the town in daily life once more. Even the children, emboldened by what they had witnessed, began to play near the edges of the square, their laughter tentative but genuine. The tension that had dominated the day slowly unraveled, leaving behind a sense of quiet possibility. The young woman and the warrior moved together toward the edge of the square, side by side. It was not a dramatic retreat or a triumphal march, but a deliberate, measured step into a future that they would face together. Every footfall echoed with intention, a statement that their choices were their own, and that courage could manifest in quiet, unassuming ways. The father watched them go, a complex mix of pride, resignation, and lingering worry etched across his face. He did not speak. 4 words could not capture the depth of change he had witnessed in both his daughter and the man who had claimed her side. As they reached the outskirts of town, the warrior turned slightly to look back. The dusty streets stretched behind them, emptying into the horizon where mountains rose against the sky. He said nothing, but his gaze was steady, acknowledging the challenges that still lay ahead. The prejudices and misunderstandings that would not disappear overnight. Yet in that same gaze was assurance, the certainty that together they could navigate what came next. The young woman drew a deep breath, the sun warming her face, and felt a sense of liberation she had never known before. The father remained in the square. Long after they had disappeared from view, watching the trail of dust settle and the town resume its rhythm, there was no triumph in his stance, no declaration of victory, only the slow, quiet reckoning of a man who had learned that control could not be forced, and that love sometimes required release. The townspeople returned to their routines as well, but the memory of the confrontation lingered, a lesson in courage, in respect, and in the unpredictable power of human will. Back on the trail beyond the town, the young woman finally allowed herself to speak fully. "I never thought I could stand like that," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. The warrior glanced at her, a small smile tugging at his lips. "You had the strength all along," he said simply. "I only helped you see it." She nodded, feeling the truth of his words settle deep inside her. For the first time she understood that strength was not the absence of fear, but the choice to act despite it. They walked in silence for a while, the wind carrying the distant sounds of the town behind them. Each step forward was a reaffirmation of autonomy, a quiet rebellion against the life she had known and the expectations she had endured. Every horizon brought possibility, every dust-covered path, a new beginning. She realized that freedom was not just the absence of control, but the presence of choice, and now she had that in abundance. The warrior paused at a small rise, looking out over the rolling plains. "The world beyond that town is wide," he said. "It will test you, challenge you, and sometimes frighten you. But it is also full of opportunities you cannot yet imagine." She followed his gaze, seeing the endless expanse of land, the promise of life unbound, the chance to live fully on her own terms. The weight of the past, though heavy at times, no longer constrained her. She had survived fear, defiance, and confrontation. Now she could embrace possibility. Their journey continued, not as an escape, but as a movement towards something greater. Every hill, every canyon, every trail carried lessons they would face together. The warrior's knowledge of survival, his quiet wisdom, and his unwavering respect for her choices were a constant reassurance. The young woman's courage, sharpened by years of hardship and reinforced by her own determination, was a force that complemented his own. Together, they moved through the world as equals, a partnership forged in conflict but strengthened in understanding. The memory of the town square lingered, not as a place of punishment or fear, but as a crucible of change. It had revealed the limits of authority, the resilience of courage, and the power of human connection. Every glance backward reminded her that even in places shaped by tradition, defiance and bravery could carve new paths. She understood now that life would always present challenges, but the lessons learned in that sun-baked square would guide her. Days passed as they traveled, and the young woman discovered the strength in simple moments, tending a fire, guiding a horse along a narrow trail, reading the signs of weather in the sky. The warrior's quiet instructions became more than survival tips. They became lessons in living deliberately, observing carefully, and entrusting both instinct and intellect. With each day, her confidence grew, as did the bond between them. A bond rooted in respect, courage, and the shared experience of overcoming the impossible together. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the sky blazed with colors of orange and crimson, they stopped near a small creek. The sound of water rushing over stones filled the silence, a soothing contrast to the chaos of the town square. She knelt to drink, feeling the cool water revive her spirit, and looked up at the warrior. He nodded, a silent acknowledgement of everything they had endured, everything they had claimed, and everything that lay ahead. The horizon stretched endlessly, and for the first time, she felt that life was entirely her own to shape. The young woman finally allowed herself to think of the future without fear, the townspeople behind them, her father's grudging understanding, and the journey ahead filled with unknown trials and discoveries. She realized that courage was not a one-time act, but a continual choice. That defiance in the right moments could create profound change, and that love and respect were most powerful when freely given, not forced. Together, they followed the trail forward, their shadows stretching long behind them in the golden light. The story of the town square remained a memory, a pivotal chapter in a larger tale of growth, courage, and freedom. But the horizon promised more adventures, more tests, and more opportunities to live fully, boldly, and deliberately. The young woman had found her voice, her strength, and her choice, and with the warrior at her side, there was no limit to what she could face. As the sun disappeared behind the hills, casting long shadows across the plains, she drew a deep breath. Feeling the wind in her hair and the dust under her boots, the past remained behind, the present held every possibility, and the future stretched wide with promise. In the quiet companionship of the warrior, in the newfound certainty of her own courage, and in the lessons learned from the confrontation that had changed everything, she understood what it truly meant to step into her life. The journey ahead was long, but for the first time, she felt prepared. The town, the father, the traditions, they would always exist in memory, but they no longer dictated her path. Every step she took forward was hers alone. Every choice a testament to the courage that had been nurtured, challenged, and claimed. And as night fell, the stars appearing one by one in the wide, endless sky, she knew that freedom was not a destination, but a journey. Journey she would embrace fully, guided by courage, partnership, and the unbreakable will to live life on her own terms. The story of the square, of defiance and of unexpected courage, had come to its close, leaving behind lessons that would resonate for a lifetime. The young woman, the warrior, and even the father had been changed, each in their own way, by the events that had unfolded under the harsh sun and watchful eyes. The world beyond the town awaited, vast, unpredictable, and full of possibility, and they would face it together, stronger and wiser for all they had endured.